And so we need to remember that what we are doing, these relationships are impacted by this. Now it seems to me, and I was going to go into this, but I'm not going to go into it in depth like I had thought I would do that. I want to describe my family to you, and so I won't embarrass you, so you don't have to talk about your family. I was one of 5 children. My oldest sister was beautiful. She was smart. She was valedictorian of her class. She was, I thought, Mom and Dad's favorite. Now, my second sister came along 9 months later, and she became everything that my older sister was not. She was very rebellious. She was in conflict a lot with my dad. And that's kind of how she conducted life. I was in the middle, so I felt like by the time I came along, I was kind of looking on at things, and there was nobody paying attention to me. Now, then I had a brother, and my mother, who all this time wanted a son, put all of her love and affection, I thought, in my brother. And then by the time my youngest sister came along, my older sister was gone, and she became the favorite, I thought. Now, if my sisters were here, they would tell you something different. But my role in my family was to keep the peace. You know, I'm supposed to keep the peace. Guess what I'm still doing? Oh my goodness, keeping the peace. So I tried to get my sister, who was rebellious, to settle down and behave because she was messing up the family system. Everybody was upset because of her, right? You have that in your family? Okay. So that family system is really interesting how it works. In a lot of families, we have the hero. That would have been my older sister. We would have had the scapegoat. That would have been my second sister. We would have had the lost person. That would have been me. So do you follow what I'm saying? There are little character roles that we play. And one of the things that they found out that was when somebody goes to get help in programs, let's say they're into alcoholism or something, they can do really well, but they come home and the family puts them back in that same little box that they were in before they left for help. Does that make sense? Are you following me? So what happens is that if we want healing in our family with homosexuality, then God is saying, okay, are you willing to be healed? Are you willing to be changed? Are you willing to change that family dynamic so that there's hope that your daughter or your son can come to some healing? So I've always thought that my joy has been to work with parents and family to help them to see maybe their own issues. And that's something I've had to see within myself. How I thought that I was better than everybody else, and everybody else needed fixing except for me. Well, when I started the ministry, I thought, well, I'm going to fix all those homosexuals. And God has a sense of humor, and He said, you're the one that I need to fix. And God began to show me my own issues and show me the ways that He wanted me to change. And one of the biggest ones was to get rid of my pride and to begin to see others as better than myself. And that's not always easy to do. It's the death that God wants us so that His life comes out, not our own. And that's what He's asking of us in this. Now, I want to bring you to an idea. You came here today to find an answer to how do I change this division in my family. So what I want to tell you today is about how important it is to talk. And Bob, you mentioned that your wife talks a lot and that women talk. Maybe you didn't say your wife, you just said women talk a lot. And that's true. I think for every word a man speaks, how many is it women speak? 2,000 or 3,000 or something like that. So we are great talkers. Now we may be authentic talkers, but we may not really be sharing our true feelings about things. Okay, this is not in your notes, and I'm going to skip to this because we don't have a lot of time. Communication is extremely important, in families especially. So there are several levels of communication, and if you want to write this down, or if you want to check with me later, I'll be glad to give you my handout on that. But there are several levels of communication, and it's so important as we begin to try to deal with conflict. Because if we don't understand this, it's really going to be a nightmare, I'll tell you that. When you are in the family and you are coming together, and let's say you're sitting at dinner, you begin to talk. Now, that's a little different than when if you walk down the street and you see somebody on the street and you say hi and they say hi, or you see somebody at church and they say, hi, how are you? And you say, fine. You don't really want to know how they are, right? You just want them to say fine because you don't really want to know. So that's a very superficial kind of communication. That's society's social conversation. You walk into a party and you talk about, hey, did you see the snow in Big Bear today? Looks like they're drowning in snow. And so you talk on very non-threatening levels, okay? The next level of communication is when you begin to talk and you get to know people a little bit better and you say, well, did you know that John down the street wrecked his car? Well, you have to know somebody for them to appreciate what you're saying to them, because you're making observations about someone that the two of you know. Now that's non-threatening as well. It's an information kind of level of talking, and it's non-threatening. Now the third level of communication is when I express my opinions about things. Now I can tell you that I'm not going to sit and tell you whether I'm Republican or Democrat today because I don't know what you are. I don't know how you feel about what's going on in the world today. So until I sit down with you one-on-one and you tell me what you think about politics or who you're for or who you're not for, I'm not going to be comfortable telling you how I feel, right? How many of you have gotten into trouble by talking about politics to somebody that you shouldn't have talked to about it? Because there is a threat. There's a real threat there. You cannot express your opinions without getting a negative feedback if you don't know who it is you're talking to. Now, sometimes within the family system, we sit down to dinner and we can get in these humongous fights over politics or whatever. I remember my father's family, all of them were very well educated. And when they would have family reunions, that was their joy, was to discuss politics and decide who was good and who wasn't and what they were doing wrong. And they thrived on it, honestly. They loved it. That was their whole way of relating to each other. But in society, they have to be very, very careful. And you'll find even in some churches, they will say, no politics, you can't talk, no talking about church histories, that kind of stuff. Because it can be very painful. It can turn people away. Okay, the kind of communication that needs to come within the family itself is communication about feelings. Now, a lot of us did not grow up talking about our feelings. I didn't. That was not allowed in my family. Now, sometimes we'll say, well, I think you're being cheap, or I think you're being wrong about this issue. Now, that is not expressing a feeling. That's expressing a thought. If we then say, I feel threatened by the fact that you're talking about walking out of the house, that's different. I feel. That's a feeling I may have. So understanding the difference between those levels of communication is very, very important when you're dealing with conflict in the family. Let me give you an example. In this forms that I gave you, there is a list of emotions. Now let's use this exercise for a moment to illustrate what I'm talking about. We've been talking about homosexuality in the family this morning and talking about the conflict that comes as a result of that. But we haven't really talked a lot about feelings related to this. So I'm looking at some of you and saying, what is happening inside of you? Would you take this feeling list and pick out one feeling and say, I feel that emotion? And we'll put the word homosexuality in that middle part and tell us why. Would you be willing to do that? What are you feeling about the homosexuality of your loved one? What is that feeling? There's lots of things to look at here. Any one of those would work. Which one would you pick out and say, I feel what?
Anxious.
Anxious, yes. Anxious not having heard from your son, I would guess particularly. Yes, very anxious.
Heavy-hearted.
Heavy-hearted, good.
Lost. Lost.
Lost. Lost.
No, lost.
Lost. You're feeling lost. Now, loss
We're
isn't...
not lost.
Okay.
I feel lost.
You're feeling loss. So along with the feeling, I don't think loss is an emotion, but I think if you put together something like, I feel... Do you see one that matches that?
I don't have this.
I feel grief, maybe?
Yeah.
I feel grief. I feel grief about my... Sorrowful. I feel sorrowful. Anybody else? Yes.
Depressed.
I feel depressed. Okay. Now, having said that, doesn't that feel better? Mm-hmm. You know why that feels better? Because we've nailed it. Now, that may not be the only emotion you're feeling. There may be others. And we go through these periods of time. It's sort of, again, like the roller coaster. There's times where we feel different things. But when we're able to nail that feeling, then it's almost like, whew, somebody let the air out of the balloon. Because now I can talk honestly about it, okay? Now, this works incredibly in families if you can learn how to do it. Now, there's some of us that are going to be resistant to it because we're going to say, well, it doesn't really matter. But if you want to talk through difficult things, you've got to be able to talk honestly about your feelings. So, let's go back to the situations in your family. Is it possible to go to your family members and say, I feel, fill in the emotion, about being separated from you, the tension in our home, the fact that I feel like I'm on the outside, we're not talking about it, whatever it is, and attach that emotion to it. The reason this is so important, well, let me see if I can illustrate this. What is the difference between if I said to you, I feel like you're being a bigot about homosexuality? Okay, now what happens to you emotionally when I say that?
Become defensive. Mm-hmm.
Defensive.
Nobody wants to be a bigot.
Nobody wants to be a bigot. You become defensive. You put up a wall. If we keep using you words and nasty things like that, then that person's going to walk away from us. The tension's going to even be greater. The division's going to be greater. Okay, let me give you another illustration. I feel isolated because I can't seem to be able to talk to you about homosexuality or whatever it is. Do you follow me? Mm-hmm. Now, in the rest of this that I have given you, it talks to you about how do we bring the family together to talk about this? Because that's how the division breaks up. Because what's happening right now is you have this person who thinks this, and this one who thinks this one who thinks this, and this one who thinks this. Until we're ready to bring that family together to talk about this issue, we're not going to be able to resolve the differences. Now, and the way you do it is through talking about your feelings. Now, it may even mean that that person who is in homosexuality becomes part of that. Does that scare the snot out of you? Mm-hmm. It does, because we don't know what's going to come out of that. And I think what's important here is that we've got to remember, number one, it takes a lot of planning, it takes a lot of prayer, a lot of thinking through about how do we resolve this conflict in our home. Now, from the standpoint that God loves us and does not want us to sin, he's got a conflict on his hands, doesn't he? Mm-hmm. But do you remember in the story of Adam and Eve how Eve listened to Satan and he said, no, God didn't really say this. And so Eve talked her husband into taking a bite of the apple, you know, and they did all these actions. Well, then after it was all over, they ran over and hid in the forest from God. And God came and found them. God continues to seek after our homosexual loved ones. He really does. We're not the one that has to do it. Isn't that nice? God is the one. Our job is to love them, to help them be comfortable in our presence, that we love them. We don't have to reject them. Because even if they are sinning, God doesn't reject us. He's saying, now you're going to reap the consequences of that. Here's what I'm going to tell you. If you do this, this is what's going to happen. But he doesn't abandon us. We cut ourselves off from God, right? We're the one that backs up. We're the one that says, I don't want anything to do with you.